Once a month, when the moon reaches its highest point in the sky and the wild creatures call out to the night, he emerges from a private sanctuary in an undisclosed location outside of Little Rock, Arkansas. Arrayed in his priestly vestments, carrying forth the good news that comic books and graphic novels aren't just for kids, that they aren't just mass and spandex superheroes, that storytelling in a graphic format can be so much more. He is the Graphic Novel Apostle.
Hello, and welcome back to the Graphic Novel Apostle podcast. I'm your host, Mark Ohrenberger. I am so happy to be back here with you as always. And also, as always, I am most excited when we are doing one of our book club episodes. And that's what we've got today. I have my friend Carson Miller here with me today. Carson, how are you, my friend?
I am doing well. I'm doing well. With this being audio only, having doing a video podcast myself, I instantly went into video mode. I started smiling. I kind of sat up a little bit straighter, and I realized I didn't have to do any of that, which is an interesting experience on this side.
Well, Carson, we always appreciate good posture and big smiles here on this podcast. And I should let the audience know that you are the co host of the Intake podcast, along with our friend Travell McManus, who is a former guest on this show and also sometimes consultant when I have something go wrong, because he knows how to work this stuff a whole lot better than I do.
Yes, he does. That was more about me than you. He helps me a lot too.
And today we are going to be discussing the book King of Nowhere, written by W. Maxwell Prince with art by Tyler Jenkins. We'll go through the credits in just a little bit more detail in a second. First, I want to go through a couple of housekeeping items. For those of you who are new to this podcast, and we have had some new listeners join us over the last couple of weeks, first I want to say welcome. I am so happy you guys are here. I hope you like what you hear. As we do these different episodes of our podcast, of course, we've got our Batman the Long Halloween series, where I am covering those issues one at a time, month by month, just by myself. I enjoy doing those episodes. I hope you enjoy listening to them. It's been fun unfolding that mystery. But my favorite thing, the reason that we have this podcast, is so that I can do these book club episodes where I share a comic or graphic novel with a friend of mine who is not a regular comics reader. Just a couple of other things to note. The Graphic Novel Apostle is now available as an audio podcast on YouTube. So it'll be a very boring video if you want to watch it there. It's just going to be the logo of the podcast. But if you are a listener of YouTube music, you can find the Graphic Novel Apostle podcast on there as well. Next thing I want to hit up, Global Comics. I have talked to you guys before about a digital subscription service that I use called Global Comics, where a lot of non Marvel and DC comics are available for a monthly fee or an annual fee to read as much of as you want or to buy digital copies of single issues. Now, they've actually got some DC comics on there now and they're expanding some of that, but types of books that we do here on this podcast, which are published by independent publishers like Boom Studios, who did King of Nowhere, often are available there. Some publishers put up their newest issues. Mad Cave Studios, which I love, I read a ton of books from Mad Cave. Usually they release their single issues same day and date on Global Comics, as they also come out in paper where you could go pick them up in a store. And so I really enjoy that. The reason I'm talking to you about Global Comics right now is I happen to have 4 codes for a free 7-day trial of Global Comics. If you want to give it a go, email me at graphicnovelapostle@gmail.com. Now, look, this is not a sponsorship here with Global Comics, although I would love to be sponsored by Global Comics. If y'all are listening, give your boy a shout. But it's a service that I use. I'd love to give you a chance to give it a try. So the first 4 people that email me with a request to get a code, I will be happy to share it with you. Next, as far as past book club episodes that I might recommend for some of our newer listeners, I got some feedback after doing that a couple of weeks ago from Kevin Ohrenberger, my dad, because I hadn't recommended his book club episode of this podcast as a back issue that people should go check out. And so, Dad, I'm sorry. So let's go ahead and make the world right. I'm going to recommend a couple of other episodes that people ought to go back and check out. First is episode number 9 with Karen Ohrenberger, my mom, where we went and talked about Friday, book 1, First Day of Christmas, written by Ed Brubaker with art by Marcos Martin. My mom was great. My dad also has an episode. You can find it if you want. And then, secondly, because we've got Carson from the Intake podcast here, I also want to recommend the episode that his co host, Gravel McManus, did with me. On this show, it was a book club. It was episode 5 of the podcast. We covered the book Radiant Black, Volume 1, which actually is a superhero comic, but it's from the independent comics, and it is cool. So I would encourage you to check it out. Carson, have you given Radiant Black a look? Have you checked out that book?
I have not had the time to check it out yet. We
Well, it's not a demand.
No, it's not a demand. I've wanted to though. It's sitting up here behind me on my dresser. With some of the things that we're doing at the Intake podcast, we did challenge each other to get back into books recently, and I instead of choosing Radiant Black, I chose the new Hunger Games book. But Radiant Black is next on my list, especially having just gone through King of Nowhere for the second time in preparations for this. I think I am ready to jump back into it, or jump into it for the first time. So
Well, I'll have to find out from you what you think about Radiant Black. I hope you enjoy that one. Hey, let's talk for a few minutes about the Intake podcast that you and Travell host.
yeah, it's been a fun ride. It's definitely been a lot more labor intensive than I think I realized when I said, "Hey, Travell, do you want to start a podcast together?" But it has been a new creative challenge, and in my life, that hasn't really been something that I've sought out a lot. Grew up more playing sport than in college and things, focused on studies and then career, and then all of a sudden found this longing for some sort of creative outlet. And having been a purveyor of many podcasts and YouTube videos and things, I was like, man, what if we just put something out there? What if I put something out there and asked Travell to brainstorm with me on how what we could do together, and we came up with the Intake podcast.
Yeah, talk to me a little bit about the format of what you guys cover and how you have the world structure, because I really like your varying size screen approach.
Part of what kind of came to our minds was that we have conversations almost every week about what we are currently watching. And those, what we're currently watching, typically falls into three different screen size categories, being big screen movies, small screen TV, and then tiny screen our phones. And so we thought about just bringing that to the table, and then also bringing to the table some thoughts and ideas about what we are intaking, hence the name, as content, and how that is affecting us as individuals, how that is affecting us communally. So when we think about, man, is a TV show worth our time? And that's been a question that we've started to ask more and more as we've developed the podcast is this worth our time? And looking at the media that we take in as something that adds to our life, and not just something that we're just apathetic to the reasons why we're intaking content. It really is just trying to be aware of what we are intaking, and then making decisions about what we keep in our lives and what we get rid of. And so that's just kind of where it's developed, and we continue to develop it as we go along.
It's fantastic. I think we could all stand to be a little more thoughtful about
Mm.
what we are taking in all the time. I know that I spend way too much time just sort of scrolling through Facebook, scrolling through Instagram. It used to be scrolling through Twitter, but I cut back on that a whole lot. I think I'm happier for it these days.
Yeah, and that's also part of it is every we will challenge each other to do something regarding content. So at the end of each episode, we have something called the outtake, where we try to be more thoughtful about the content we're consuming. And so, like I had mentioned earlier, one of our challenges was to read more books. And so we challenged each other that for 3 nights out of one week, we had to sit down and read a book. And it forced me to get off my phone, to stop watching TV, and get into a book series that I thoroughly enjoy in the Hunger Games, and read the new novel that had been sitting on my nightstand for about a month or so. So that we're trying to be aware of some of those things and challenge each other to even consume something that the other person may like. So I made Travell watch 3 episodes of Star Trek, and he made me watch an anime movie. And so then getting each other's perspectives on what each of us enjoys was also kind of a fun twist that we tried to put on our content consumption for a week.
It was fun as a listener too when you guys did that. And the takeaway that I had was Travell, I think, enjoyed Star Trek quite a bit more than you enjoyed the anime movie that he gave you. Is that fair?
I think that's fair, and I don't really know if that has anything to do with the medium of anime, but rather the specific movie.
Fair enough. And you guys were kind enough to have me on as a guest for an episode where you all got into a book. It was your first dive into a graphic novel as part of the Intake podcast, which I guess doesn't fit the big screen, small screen, tiny screen. It's just a page with not a screen.
Right.
But we talked all about on that episode my favorite character in all of comics, the Silver Surfer. We did a graphic novel, Silver Surfer Homecoming. We also talked about the Fantastic Four Rise of the Silver Surfer movie and the absolutely weird and out there Silver Surfer cartoon series available on Disney Plus from the
Yep.
late 90s that I know is beloved in your household, or that is your household growing up.
Yep.
Um, I didn't quite have the same reaction to that series as an adult.
No, and that's totally fair. Going back to it, it has very little to offer in value, but it does. That TV series does have a lot of characters that are in the MCU now,
Yep,
and it was kind of cool to get to see them in a different context, especially Thanos, who was kind of a crybaby in the Silver Surfer TV show. But no,
he
that was a
really
lot of
was.
fun. He really was. It was rough for him, but it was a lot of fun to have you on and to get to deep dive into the Silver Surfer. We have really seen or gotten a lot of feedback on that episode, and it's been just a fun ride. And when I think about it, it was the first graphic novel I've read a few. The Long Halloween you're talking about earlier, that is one of my favorites, and Superman Red Sun. So a few kind of the big superhero ones, but the Silver Surfer comic was the first one I'd ever read on an iPad, and that was kind of an eye-opening or maybe world-opening experience for me to know that I could just have it there and I didn't have to keep track of a physical book or try to bookmark a comic book. So I thoroughly enjoyed getting to explore that version of graphic novels and comics.
I love a graphic novel on the iPad as well. It looks so good in that
Hmm.
format. And so, if any of our listeners want to check out the Intake podcast, we will put some links in the show notes for where you can find that podcast on YouTube, because they do a video version of their podcast, as well as a link for the audio version if you want to check that out. And I hope that you will. So, Carson, where can people connect with you and Travell and check out more about the Intake podcast?
Yeah, so you can find us at The Intake Pod on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and then on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts at The Intake Podcast. And you can contact us at intakepod@gmail.com. So if you have anything that you want to recommend for us, any ideas for outtakes, that is something that we're going to start asking for is what are things that we can challenge each other to do in our content consumption or lack thereof, a content fast maybe, and we would love to hear from you guys and love for you guys to check out Mark's episode with the Silver Surfer. It was a ton of fun to kind of do a holistic view of a character as best we could in all of the various forms we've received him in.
Awesome. Well, let's get into the book that we're here to talk about today, King of Nowhere. And let me run down the credits for that book just quickly for you. The writer of that book was W. Maxwell Prince. He is also the writer of an anthology horror sci fi series called Ice Cream Man, which is creepy, probably too creepy for Carson. I won't recommend it to him. It is weird and it is page turning. I love Ice Cream Man. I'm actually quite surprised we haven't done that one yet. He is also the writer of the book Art Brute, and we covered Art Brute here on the Graphic Novel Apostle podcast. The artist here is Tyler Jenkins, and the colors were done by Hilary Jenkins. I assume they're married. I don't know, and I couldn't find any information one way or another on the podcast, but they have paired together on a handful of books where Tyler Jenkins has been the artist and Hilary has done the colors. Letters for this book were done by Andworld Design. The book was published by Boom Studios in 5 single issues between March and September of 2020. And the collected volume that we're going to talk about today was published in December of 2020. And so we're going to cover all 5 issues of King of Nowhere. So let me read the blurb that appears on the back of the book to give people an idea of what this is all about before we get into our discussion. In the parched wastelands of California, a lovable drunken lowlife named Dennis awakens on the outskirts of an odd little village called Nowhere, home to a friendly populace of deformed, mutated, and just left of normal citizens. Not knowing where he is, or how he got there, or if this town is even real, Dennis acquaints himself with the townsfolk. But just when he starts to regain his memories, his past catches up with him. What at first seems like merely a bad trip quickly heightens into a drama of mistaken identities, small town conspiracy, and high stakes fantasy fulfillment. Carson, I love movies, books, whatever, stories that involve a protagonist who can't remember their past and over the course of the story has to sort of work backward to unravel the mystery of who they are or how they got to where they are or why the circumstances they find themselves in are upon us. A couple of examples that I thought of just off the top of my head. Memento, it's certainly very different. This one feels more like it's like a drug-induced blackout that we're picking up memory on, as opposed to something like Memento. Of course, we've got the Jason Bourne movies where Matt Damon's character sort of awakens at one point to discover he has all these special skills and have to figure out, how do I have them? Why do I have them? Who am I even? But probably the closest analog to the book that we're here to talk about today would be The Hangover.
Oh, I knew you were going to go there. I knew it.
Did you? I was wondering whether you thought about some of those other media stories like this.
I hadn't. I had not looked at this from that perspective necessarily, but as soon as you said it, I thought of Memento, and the Born Identity series makes a lot of sense. And I actually want to go back and rewatch those, as I was listening to something the other day, and somebody said that just due to the era that they were made, they don't hold up as much as you would hope they would. And so I want to go back and see if that's true. That's a total side note, but
The
um,
Jason Bourne movies?
yeah, the Jason Bourne movies, just with some of the
Huh.
technology and things that are so vital to the way they tell that story, that in today's world they just don't add up quite as much as they used to. And I want to go back and see if that's true. I don't know if it's true or not. It's just what I heard somebody say.
Oh,
Um,
that's weird. Yeah, I
yeah,
I have to feel like those would hold up for me,
yeah,
but I don't know. Maybe I need to go back and do that check too.
right.
Let
Or
me
maybe
ask you.
maybe it wouldn't hold up for a new viewer nowadays. If like we got somebody from who's like 18 or 19 has never seen them, they may not look at them the same way that we saw them when they were coming out in the early
Well,
and
that
mid
makes a lot of
2000s.
sense. Sure.
And then The Hangover makes a lot of sense. I had not thought of that one, but as you were talking about the Bourne movies, I was like, oh, he's going to say The Hangover, and
I'm not
I think
wrong.
that's true. No, you're not wrong.
Well, hey, talk to me a little bit about your impressions overall of reading this book because this book is weird.
Yes, it is weird.
So, how did you take it in? How did this book hit you as you were reading it? I've been really dying to know since I handed a copy of this book to you.
Yeah. So I've read it twice. I read it a few weeks ago and kind of read it in chunks, and I was like, yeah, it was good. It was kind of the way I walked away from it, and I wasn't really able to pinpoint what parts I thought were good and what parts I was like, man, I'm not really sold on this. And then in my second read, and I think that a second read for this one might be important, I noticed a lot more of the details that help tell Dennis's story, our main character, as he is regaining his memories and learning about this kind of new world that he is in, this new town that he's in. You notice some of those details, and I think that helps make it a better story. It may be due to my lack of reps in reading graphic novels that some of those things I didn't catch on to the first time through, and then after getting done reading it the second time, I feel much more confident in what I like and much more confident in what I don't like about this story. So I think a second read is probably my most important takeaway. And it's easy to say with this one because it's only 5 issues kind of bound together. You could read it in one sitting, no problem. If you had an hour and a half, you could read through the whole thing, which I find helpful almost because not even with a novel do you do that very often, is sit it in one reading.
That is something I love about graphic novels is the idea of sort of the efficiency that
Mm.
you can, really take your time and linger on each panel and each page. And sometimes I do that, but I also like the idea of I can crunch through this story and move on to the next one if it's something that I don't find myself loving, or it's not going to take away from me getting to check out something else new if I want to spend an hour to go back and reread something I did before. And Carson, I had the same reaction you did. I was kind of in the tank from the beginning for this book, even though it's not a very well known comic. But because I had previous experience with W. Maxwell Prince and love his work, especially on Ice Cream Man, so well, and also with Tyler Jenkins, he did a book with Matt Kint called Grass Kings that he was the artist on, and I thought he was fantastic on that too. And so I knew that I was going to like this book, and I certainly did on my first read through. But when I went back and reread the book more carefully for this episode, man, I found it to be so much more of a page turner than I did the first time. And
Yep.
I was way more impressed with the story overall than I was the first time, even though I knew some of the twists and turns that were coming. And there's some big revelations in this book. I should say for our listeners as well that we are a spoiler full podcast here. So if you don't want to be spoiled, this is your time to check out and then come back after you've read it because we are going to spoil the fool out of this book. One more comment, too, about W. Maxwell Prince. There are a lot of writers whose writing style and their storytelling style in comics I really like. But of all the different creators in comics that I revisit every time they've got a new project, W. Maxwell Prince is the one who I sit and think about sometimes how I would like to crawl inside his head and just look around for a while at some of the just wild ideas that he has. That certainly turns up a lot in Ice Cream Man, but we see it a ton here in King of Nowhere as well. I mean, listeners, we're about to introduce you to a fish man character and a rat man character and a guy with six arms and all this stuff that fits within the world that he's created here. But then also, like in his narration, there are these little turns of phrase where Prince just looks at the world a little differently than I think most of the rest of us do. And I am always intrigued by the way he thinks about formulating the message he wants to communicate. Well, let's go ahead and dive into this story, and we can maybe reflect on some of those ideas a little bit more as we get in. So, chapter one, main character that Carson referenced a few minutes ago is a guy by the name of Dennis. And he is going to wake up on the edge of some woods just below a highway. And he's going to look up and start wondering where he is. And Carson, I want to look at page one
Hmm.
because there's something here that I did not notice the first time I read the book, went right past it. And on my second reading, caught and really enjoyed to see. So, first of all, I would describe, and tell me if you agree with this, Carson. I would describe Tyler Jenkins' art style as more abstract than
Hmm.
what we would usually think of as comic book art. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. It is definitely abstract, and I might even say it's a little rough around the edges, intentionally so. And I'll be honest, that's not my favorite throughout this, where some of what they're trying to depict is so out there and fantastical that I want it to be a little bit more solidified in what it is and a little less, I don't know, sketchy. Not in a negative way, but like in a drawing type way, a little less sketchy in the way it's depicted. Does that make sense?
Oh, it absolutely does. And that is my initial reaction. Like if somebody just handed me this book and I was unfamiliar with it and said, "Hey, what do you think of the art in this book?" And I just kind of paged through it a little bit, I would say, not for me.
Mm-hmm.
But as
Same.
I read it in the context of this story, I love it
Mm.
because while my mind is grasping for a clearer picture sometimes, I think the nature of this story, which has a little bit of a fear and loathing in Las Vegas quality to it, that is, I mean, our main character, Dennis, just assumes when he wakes up here that because he can't remember where he is, it's because he was on a bender of some kind.
Right.
and makes a lot of assumptions about what he's experiencing based off that normal experience that he has.
Mhm.
So I like the idea of it being a little fuzzier. And then the color here, I assume, I don't know this, but just from looking at it, I would guess that Hilary Jenkins must have painted this with watercolors.
Uh-huh. Yep.
And watercolor can be a little imprecise as well. So, where some of the color might drift past the lines that demark the figure or separate one figure from another, I think that's useful with the abstract aesthetic of this book. So, looking at number one, page number one, that is, did you catch this, Carson? We see in the foreground Dennis waking up, and the background is just some woods. And I guess we get kind of the ground along the roadside here.
Mhm.
But if you look more carefully at the woods behind Dennis, within the trees and things that are meant to be like just kind of brush, you see the figure of Dennis's face on its side.
Mhm.
And then down to the right, about the middle of the page, same thing with what is supposed to be just like some rocks and dirt and that kind of thing on the side of the road. You can actually make out the fish face of Jed, our other main character. Did you catch that?
I did on my second. I caught Dennis's face on my second read. I did not catch Jed's until you directed me to look at this page, and as I was looking at it, I did kind of catch it. It's a little bit Jed, the fish character, for those listening. His face in this picture is a little bit more abstract than Dennis's is. Dennis's is a little bit more. I can't think of the right word, but it's more there than Jed's is.
Yeah. Well, Dennis's face is a little more defined than
Defined,
Jed's
yes.
is. So once he wakes up, Dennis starts inner monologuing in that unusual narrative voice that W. Maxwell Prince, in my opinion, uses so well. And the thing that I find most striking here is that once Dennis wakes up and stands up and sort of brushes the dirt and the leaves off of, his pants a little bit, he just sort of stretches and goes about his day, and he's very, like, shockingly composed. I mean, you might even see sanguine about the situation that he's confronting. Like,
Right.
as things are going to start getting real weird real fast, too. And he takes it completely in stride. And of course, in narrating to us, he assumes that he is on an acid trip. And he says, I just need to ride this out. Like, okay, things are going to get weird. I guess I'm going to meet some fishmen and that kind of thing.
Right.
But, he encounters it like, hey, man, nothing that I do here or say here is going to affect me in any real way. So he walks into town. And as Dennis is walking into town, this Jeep pulls up and a guy leans over out of the driver's seat. And it's a deer man. He's got a buck head and he's got this big bushy head of hair with this giant rack of antlers coming out of it. And so after Dennis has just a quick exchange with this guy, who we're going to later learn is named John Doe, which I think is a pretty good name for a deer, even if it is a buck.
It's a great name. I caught that more on my second go around. Some of the puns that are in here.
Sure. But in his internal monologue, he says to himself, poison in your brain is doing its directional thing. I mean, that's just how he conceives of what's going on.
Yeah, and his this monologue, it is kind of jarring at first for somebody that's not used to it, especially when sometimes at the bottom right hand corner you get the monologue of a person that is not on your current page but is on the next page, and that
Yeah,
can be very distracting, especially in the first time through, which is one of the reasons I think it's a better read the second time, is that you can anticipate what's coming as opposed to being confused about this random line at the bottom of the page.
sure. That can be distracting. I've come to really appreciate that. A lot of comic writers use that tool
Mm-hmm.
to sort of either lead into the next page where you get
Mm-hmm.
maybe the current speaker's like half of their sentence, and then it carries on and transitions to what someone else is doing as you
Right.
get the second half of the sentence on the next page, or you get the start of what another character wants to tell you, and then
Mm-hmm.
you're introduced to a new character. And it does sort of jar you a little bit, but you also get to see that, oh, there are some similarities between how the characters are taking things in or what their experiences are. And I think that's one of those neat storytelling tricks that is unique to the comics format.
Mm-hmm.
because you don't have a page turn in in a movie or in television, and even though you have a page turn in prose, you don't have the picture to go along with it that puts you in a very different scene.
Right. Right. And I think I enjoyed it more when it was the first half of a thought as opposed to the start of a thought from somebody that I'm not currently viewing on my page. And I found that, especially not knowing the characters as well, especially initially, I found it hard to. I would find myself flipping back and forth between the pages, making sure that I was reading it correctly. But it isn't a very interesting tool and something that is unique to this. And I came to enjoy it by the end of my second read. It just became very natural at that point, for sure.
Sure. So as Dennis sort of ambles along down this highway, he gets to the edge of the town and he encounters a sign for it that says, "Welcome to North Waharic, population 999." The way you see the sign, some of the letters in North and some of the letters in Waharic have either faded out or washed out over time. And so if you were to smush them together, it reads, "Welcome to Nowhere." And then you also have a speed limit sign that he looks at as he's walking in, and the speed limit is 37. So, different world, right?
Right. It is. It is very much at this point. Dennis is questioning whether this is a dream or a trip, a bad trip or not. And the speed limit sign being 37 is a clue to the reader that this might actually be a dream. And so you're continuing this journey of discovery with Dennis because that's there. And that's one of those little details that I picked up on the second read where I was like, ah, that's clever. I see why Prince or Jenkins is putting that there.
Yeah. So at this point in our story, Dennis assumes that he's hallucinating. And I think we as the reader have been given plenty of clues to make us think as well, yeah, he's probably right. The guy with the deer head and the speed limit sign of 37, those things probably aren't real. And if you weren't sure that what you were seeing was real to this point, you're really going to start feeling like things are not real when you turn the page and he enters a bar that is something like the cantina scene from Star Wars. And for our listeners, I should say, we are recording this, although it won't come out for about another week. We're recording this on May the 4th. So May the 4th be with you all and with you, Carson.
And with you.
Well, thank you so much. But as we look at these characters that Dennis encounters as soon as he walks in, one guy has got like these short devil horns growing out of his forehead. There's another guy sitting there, in the bar just having a drink and he's got blue skin. There's a woman who's got like big housefly sort of wings coming out of her back and a tail. And then the bartender, who's maybe the most interesting looking character in this scene, is a guy who has a normal head, except that it is upside down on top of his neck. And then, of course, sitting at the bar, there's also a fish man that we are going to get to know a whole lot better in just a minute. So as Dennis sits down and happens to sit down on this bar stool next to Jed, our human, walking around as a man with the head of a fish and gills on the side of his neck. And man, I thought this looked like a catfish. It refers to him as a salmon a couple of times.
Hmm.
But, he's got those whiskers sort of like a catfish does and that big wide mouth like a catfish.
Yeah, that was my assumption too. I wasn't sure if the salmon comment was more um, in jest or demeaning to refer to him as a specific type of fish that he may or may not be. I could be wrong about that, but that was sort of my interpretation of those salmon comments later on.
Oh, that may be. That may be. So, our first impression of Jed, we are going to know right away what type of character this guy is. And I don't mean a fish type character. I mean, he's going to lean over and start making, you know, pleasant small talk with Dennis and hits him up to buy him a drink. First of all, he makes a joke about how he's a fish and so he's very thirsty all the time. And then he starts talking to Jed. And then he starts talking to Dennis, this guy that he has just met, about how he's worried, this problem that he has, that a guy with a whole bunch of arms is about to come in the door and take him outside and beat him up. And so we know this is a guy who's probably, he probably trades on personality a lot. He probably, is like a small time grifter, gets by on his little scams. They catch up with him once in a while, and he kind of expects that too. Somebody who maybe your mom would tell you that you don't want to be friends with all the time.
Yeah.
Am I on the right track here?
You're on the right track. He's somebody that Michael Scott would, do anything for. If you know The Office at all, that he could get Michael Scott to buy him a drink and then help him out of a jam with somebody that he got in trouble with. This bar scene is very reminiscent of something from The Office. And the more I'm studying it here, the more I just keep thinking, oh, Dennis.
That is exactly right. What was that character's name early on? And there was a version of this character in the British version of The Office as well
Mm-hmm.
that Michael Scott was always talking about. He couldn't wait until this guy showed up. He was a sales rep from like another division. And,
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, Scott would get like all mad about some prank until he figured out that it was actually Finch. Was it David
Uh,
Finch?
no, it wasn't
Or
David
was that
Finch. It was that might
David
be the
Finch was the
British
guy?
one.
That's right. David Finch was
Uh,
the name of the character in the British version.
in the U.S. version, it's Todd Packer. Where,
Packard.
yeah,
That's right.
yep.
Yeah, he's your Todd Packard type character. That is a great comparison. And so, sure enough, this six-armed man shows up. It's a guy by the name of Cullen, and he comes into the bar. He's not only got six arms, but he's big and he's kind of buffed up looking. And he's got two guys behind him, which are his cronies, and they sort of look like rat men. And probably rat men can scrap and fight a little bit if they need to. And meanwhile, still Dennis is just taking this all in stride. And he's trying to tell Jed, like, dude, don't worry about this. You are a figment of my imagination. This is all part of a bad LSD trip that I'm having. So it doesn't really matter what happens next. And, Jed is like, man, I wish I had the same perspective you did because I'm about to get killed by these guys. And so, sure enough, these guys take Jed out into the street and they start roughing him up. And Dennis decides, man, maybe I can play the hero here in my acid trip. And so he goes out there and he squares off with the six-armed man, and they start getting into a pretty good little scrap. Dennis is giving it, and Dennis is taking it too. I mean, he's getting his nose bloodied a little bit in this fight. But by the end of the chapter, Dennis realizes that this insanity that he's experiencing is not an acid trip. It is real, and he can tell by the bruises on his cheek and the blood on his shirt. Well, at the end of this chapter, we've got this little epilogue as well, and it's our first opportunity to get a glimpse at something else that is going on in this world or maybe outside of this world and acting upon it. So we go back to that deer man in the Jeep, John Doe, and he's trying to make his way out of town. It seems like John Doe has like had enough of this weird place called nowhere. He's going to go try and make his way in the regular world. Well, as he does, he encounters a man who's got the road blocked, and he's a regular human man. He's standing in civilian clothes. He's not like a police officer or anything. Really, he's wearing like a pair of coveralls with the sleeves cut off, and he looks just sort of like a hick a little bit. And he's got a nail gun. And he goes up to John Doe once he gets Doe to stop his car, and he starts asking John Doe about Dennis. He's even got a picture of Dennis. And after he finds out what little he can from John Doe about Dennis, this guy just picks up that nail gun and shoots it right through John Doe's head and leaves him dead on the side of the road, and then just starts to stroll into town. So we know we've got a bad guy coming in.
It's a very interesting scene to be left off with. It definitely piques your interest as if you're unsure of what has happened just in this single issue before, and whether this is a dream or real. You're starting to get to the sense that it is real, and it's just a world that we are unfamiliar with. And it is this character with the nail gun is menacing because of the unique choice of weapon, because of the nonchalant nature that he seems to be acting with, and the fact that he is just walking into town. It doesn't seem to have any vehicle of any sort and just continues forward on his mission.
Yeah, it kind of reminded me of Anton Chigurh in No Country for Old Men. That was
Mm-hmm.
Javier Bardem's character, and he
Yep.
went around with that tool that they use for killing cattle,
Uh
that
huh.
like pneumatic tool. Something kind of similar, a similar weapon and a similar sort of nonchalant approach to life and death. Well, before we
Yeah.
go on to chapter two, I went right past something that's actually kind of significant here.
Yeah.
We have our first meeting with a couple of characters who are going to be important in our story. The fight that Dennis is in with Cullen is broken up by the sheriff, who is a very normal looking human. He has an eye patch over one eye, but he is human in all ways. And we also meet his daughter, Ellie, who is human like, but also has kind of a cat face and cat ears. So she is not human in the same sense, I guess, that her dad is. Well, as Dennis and the sheriff are having this meeting back at the sheriff's office, because you can tell nowhere is not the kind of place that gets a lot of outsiders very often. And Dennis is sitting there having this very casual conversation with the sheriff. Ellie comes rushing in and she tells the sheriff the monsters are loose, basically.
Hmm.
And so the sheriff grabs Dennis, is like, come on, you're going along with us, and pushes him into the passenger seat of his patrol vehicle. And they put on their lights and sirens and they go flying out to the edge of town where a couple of giant iguanas have sort of, in a Godzilla like way, started to rampage on the outskirts of this town. And they've got to use, I don't know, basically shotguns, regular human weapons, to try and drive these kaijus back into the forest. And one of them picks the sheriff up with his tongue, has him all wrapped up, and nearly gets to eat him before the skirmish is done. Kind of a wild experience. There's one other thing that on their way there, they're, driving and we're seeing the scenery of the town passing by us. And we happen to see just one glimpse of a guy in a hazmat suit and a
Hmm.
gas mask. And we have no explanation for what he's doing there. He's just standing in this field with this dog that's got two tails. And we have kind of a little bit of a mystery, I guess, about what this guy's deal is. That does not have any light shed on it in this first issue.
No, it doesn't. And to be honest, on first read, I don't remember him popping up at all. And I think there's just so much of being overwhelmed by the new world and these really wacky characters that seeing a guy pop up for two panels on a page, you instantly forget about. And I think part of that is by design, that Dennis would drive past a character, which is essentially what's happening here on the page, and also not really register what he's just seen. And I think that's very intentional and very clever by the authors.
For sure. And I will say, I don't think I took any real note of that. The guy in the hazmat suit is not commented upon in any
Mhm.
way. It is just sort of part of the scenery of this town. And also, we've talked about the abstract nature of the art. It's a little bit harder for you as a reader to process everything that you're seeing. And you're already by now trained to expect that most of the things you see are going to be weird.
Yep.
And so easy for the storytellers to just sneak something in here that will have bearing on our story later on, but isn't even passing notice at this point.
Right. And I think maybe a helpful comparison for our listeners would be that to me, this world feels very much like the Fallout TV show. Mark, I'm not sure if you watched that this past year, but
I
in
didn't.
a kind of post apocalyptic where you still have some buildings standing, but every character has some sort of deformity or uniqueness to them. It very much feels like Fallout, which was a helpful reference point for me to have some sort of anchor to pull from in this world. So
Okay.
it would be a good, even if you just looked up some pictures from the Fallout TV show, I think you'd see it and be able to understand this world just a tiny bit better, seeing it through that lens.
A type of story that I tend to get turned off by, or maybe not even want to usually dip my toes into, is a post apocalyptic world.
Okay.
And that is a bit of what we have here. I love Walton Goggins, the actor. I have
Hmm.
loved him in so many things, going all the way back to The Shield and the small character that he played in Sons of Anarchy. Of course, his role in Justified. I mean, he's great in everything he does. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to watch Fallout because I'm like, ugh, I don't like a post apocalyptic desert landscape.
Yeah. I think I don't know. The more I'm thinking about it, some more similarities I'm seeing between this story and that story, where you do have a character who doesn't necessarily have amnesia or memory loss, but is an outsider in that world due to
Sure.
the nature of the show, and she is learning the world as she goes in kind of a similar setting to King of Nowhere. So I think you might like it, especially if you like Walton Goggins, who is fantastic in the show. You might enjoy it. I'd say give it maybe 2 or 3 episodes because I can't remember if the first episode takes you outside of the area where they're at initially, but give it 2 to 3 episodes and see if you like it. I would say.
I will. I will commit to that.
Okay, I'm gonna hold you to it. I'm gonna ask you every week.
You should. You should.
No,
Hey,
I won't do that
as
to
a
you.
reader, where are you to the extent you can remember from your first read? As a reader, where are you at the end of chapter 1? Are you like compelled to move forward? Are you turned off by how weird this all is? I picked this book for you because you told me that you like sci-fi,
Uh huh.
and I tend not to, or I tend to think I don't like sci-fi, and I always figure out that I like it better than I originally expected. And this is a
Right.
sci-fi tale.
It is. It is a sci-fi tale. It is also. It does have fantastical elements to it, which all sci-fi does. But this is not like Star Trek sci-fi. There was part of me that wanted to keep reading because I don't think. I think so. In the way this chapter is laid out, the character with the nail gun who kills John Doe at the end is an epilogue, and I think if we don't have that epilogue, I'm not sure I continue on because where
Oh,
the
interesting.
actual chapter ends is the post iguana giant iguana fight, and I don't at least on my first read I don't have a sense of there's nothing compelling me to read more. I still think that he might be on some sort of trip, or he might be in some different world other than our own. I'm not really sure what's going on here. It gets a little. It's more Star Wars than it is Star Trek, if you will. You have giant creatures. You have fantastical characters. The cantina scene. All of this is less sterilized than Star Trek sci-fi, if that makes sense.
Oh, fair enough. Yeah, that does make some sense.
It's more Western.
It does have a Western quality to it for sure. And as you were describing the type of sci-fi this is a few minutes ago here, it hit me that Twilight Zone.
Mm,
This has a Twilight Zone quality to it,
yes.
and that's sci-fi I can always get behind.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's very interesting. I hadn't thought of it like that. It definitely is. It definitely, especially like you said at the beginning of our episode here, it doesn't seem like the story continues on. It was written in 2020 and there's been no further issues. So it is very episodic in that way, to use a TV phrase, but just like the Twilight Zone is, where it's a one shot story.
Yeah, and I think by the end of this, for as much as I enjoyed it, I think I had what I wanted out of this world too.
Mm, yeah.
And I'll pick this up again off my shelf, there's no doubt about it, but I also don't need a second volume.
I might disagree to some degree, but I think we'll get to that when we get to the end of our story here.
Ooh,
As we're looking at this first chapter here, there's one thing that I really caught on to on my second reading. And it is as the sheriff is driving Dennis from the sheriff station to go deal with these iguanas, which again is a weird thing that the sheriff picks up a guy who's in a fight, takes him to the sheriff's office, and says, "Well, you're new here. Let's come shoot some giant iguanas together." And that's a very interesting line of events.
hey, if I gotta face off with giant iguanas, I am taking anyone who's around with me as well.
True.
Yeah, maybe he's planning to push Dennis in front of himself.
Right, maybe dispensable in some way, especially, and that may come into context a little bit more as we get further into the story. But as they're driving, we kind of get those thought blurbs again from Dennis, where it's his internal monologue, and he starts talking about a Jane Ingerwood, a middle school sweetheart of his, and just keeps talking about her in his head, that she had lion shaped barrettes and sundresses covered in lilac print, but that she also had webbed feet. And she had a surgery to correct that, but she was compassionate. And even though she had her scarred appendages and post surgery waddle, and he wonders where she is now and wonders if she would recognize his face. And I think that's very interesting that in a time where he is very uncertain with where he is, what is happening, that his mind wanders back to something that is reminiscent of the world that he's in, somebody that had some sort of deformity in his life, but also what seems to be a person of peace in his life, a moment of peace in his life, a middle school sweetheart that he is wondering about. And
Yeah.
as we kind of know that he has struggled with drugs and alcohol, there's part of me that wonders if his interaction with Jane was pre substance abuse. And that in this time of trouble and uncertainty, his mind is wandering back to this place of peace and security that he may have had with Jane in their youth. And I think that's a very cathartic moment and very soft moment for Dennis in this very harsh world that he's been thrown into.
Yeah, I like that. And dreams are weird, and I'm a
Mm,
vivid dreamer. But we always try and connect those things that happen in our dreams to stuff in real life. And,
right.
as Dennis is sort of coming to the realization that this is actually happening, but he's used to experiencing weird things like this as part of, his drug-induced trips or, blackout drunkenness. The unusual is kind of normal for him, and
Hmm.
he's trying to connect it to something that he thinks of in real life.
Right. I just thought it was a very, I don't know, knowing. So insight into kind of my world is a little bit is that I work in a place where there's a recovery program with men and women who have struggled with substance abuse, and so there's some of this where I've noticed like some of the patterns that they have and that I've been around for 6 or 7 years now, and you see some of that in Dennis's life, and so this throwback to that middle school, it really does connect and make it seem like a very real story covering the topic of substance abuse in this way.
What an interesting insight. Person, thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate you sharing that. Let's go on to chapter 2. So Dennis wakes up in Jed's house, and Jed has got a plan. He's got, Jed is a man who always has a scheme of some kind. And this is a little more straight down the middle. It's not like they're going to go scheme somebody. Jed's money making idea that he's got here after we've come through getting beat up in an alley and an iguana fight is they're going to borrow this axe from the hardware store, where, by the way, the owner has a second head that grows out the side of his neck, and the smaller head, which is the appendage, has a separate and distinct personality from the main head, and they're always in conversation with one another. And when the store owner sees Jed coming in, it's almost like you can see both heads rolling their eyes because they know there's going to be some kind of scheme afoot. But sure enough, they loan this axe to Jed, and he and Dennis are going to go out in the woods and they're just going to chop firewood and they're going to pay for the axe with firewood that they chopped. Very weird way to start the next day after all the events of the night before.
Right.
Well, while that is going on, the sheriff and Ellie have discovered John Doe's body out there on the edge of town. Now, also, meanwhile, that guy with the nail gun, we get a glimpse into what he's doing right now, and he's going into that bar, which hasn't opened yet for the day. And he goes in and he sort of shakes down that upside down faced bartender for information about Dennis. And once he gets that information, once again, he's got no more use for the guy. He probably doesn't want to be remembered, leave no witnesses behind. And he pulls out his nail gun again and he kills our bartender. Well, as Dennis and Jed are out there in the woods, Dennis kind of goes wandering off to find some other logs that he can bring back for Jed to chop. And while he's doing that, he sees that man in the hazmat suit again.
Hmm.
But again, as the reader, at least on your first time through, you're still just perceiving this as like, oh, there's a guy out in the woods. Maybe are we going to have an encounter with him now? But we don't. What happens instead is Dennis hears Jed calling for him. He's in some kind of trouble, and he goes running back to find that Dennis is ensnared in the branches of this tree, which is also part man. And we've seen tree men before. We've got the Ents from the Lord of the Rings series. Wasn't there a character named Treebeard in
Yes,
one of
there
these things?
there is in Lord of the Rings, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, from this tree person, who is going to tell us a little bit about his backstory. We are also going to learn something useful about what is going
Mm,
on in the world of nowhere. So, throughout their conversation, this tree person tells Dennis and Jed that he was once a man and there was also once a tree. So, he was a man named Greg and there was a normal tree in the woods. And Tree Greg makes reference to this quote, invisible heat in the air, poison wind, strange sickness borne on its sputtering tendrils. And then he explains that now he's Tree Greg instead of just Greg and a tree. Well, the nail gun man has learned that Jed and Dennis are somewhere out there in the woods, and
mm,
he goes out and starts a forest fire that Dennis and Jed just see from a distance. They can't really figure out what's going on. Well, while all of this is happening, the sheriff is back at his office and he gets a phone call from a caller who is unknown to us. We only get one side of the conversation. And from hearing Sheriff Tucker's end of this conversation, by the way, we've learned that his name is Tucker, we can tell that Sheriff Tucker actually knows who's been committing these killings around town and that the sheriff is working somehow in cahoots with the person who sent this nail gun man into nowhere. And we're left
mm.
with that as sort of our cliffhanger at the end of this issue.
Yeah, it's a very interesting place. Again, a very good lead in to the next thing that makes you want to keep reading. I think at this point, upon my first reading, I was in, and on my second reading, I was thoroughly enjoying catching the little details about the hardware store guy with the second head, and you know how the guy with the nail gun was going about his business. Again, on the first time, you're still trying to juggle this whole world and keep track of these characters. It's a pretty big cast. When I typed out the characters that we meet per chapter, you meet almost all of your main characters in the first chapter, and then you continue on, and it's a pretty wide cast, I would say, for a 5 chapter issue or 5 chapter book. Here is this, would you say this is a high character count or a low character count compared to other graphic novels that are similar to this?
Yeah, I would say it's a fairly high character count.
And that was a part of the struggle to get through it. First was keeping track of, okay, who is this person, why are they important, and by the on the second reading you know why they're important, and so you're paying attention to some of the details that the storytellers are giving to you, especially
Sure.
at the beginning of chapter 2. We do get an actual dream sequence. So we go from chapter 1 that we're not sure if it's a dream or not, and you're still kind of left wondering a little bit until the epilogue that it's whether it's real or not. And then we get what is a true dream sequence of Dennis coming down the stairs to, was either his significant other and their child, and he's coming down to her singing to their child, and then he gets scolded for having overslept, and he explains by saying rough night, and she hands him the baby and says all your nights are rough. Me, I just got it easy, I just need to take care of a baby, which we both know is not an easy task. And
Amen.
um, then we see that it's a dream sequence because when he looks down at the baby, it is Jed's face, but in baby form, yelling at him to wake up. But we get at what the authors would have depicted as a true dream sequence, which again tells us, okay, what is happening is real, and it is not. It confirms officially that it is not a bad trip or a dream sequence for Dennis.
Sure.
And I enjoyed that insight into his backstory as well. You start to get some bits and pieces of who he is and what may motivate him as he moves forward.
We definitely do. We're getting a deeper understanding of who the man Dennis is. So, as we move into chapter 3, through a lot of this chapter, what we're seeing are these small vignettes of life in nowhere. And a lot of it deals with characters that we haven't been introduced to. But what is occurring in the art, the events themselves, are much less important than the voice of this new narrator we
Mm,
have. And we're not sure who it is. But this voice is obviously observing what's going on with all of these characters in nowhere from the most mundane parts of life, and he's commenting on them as they're happening. And what becomes clear to us as a reader is that someone is watching all of the residents of Nowhere, and that they've been doing so for a very long time.
Mm,
So, as we turn now towards some of the events that actually do matter to our story, Ellie finds Dennis and Jed asleep in the burnt down woods, and she takes them into custody. And through their conversation, she says, "Look, I don't suspect you guys of having been the one who were committing all these murders, because the only new element in town essentially is Dennis showing up. Dennis and Jed are going to stay right by her side until she solves this mystery of who's committing these killings." What we've also seen leading up to this as well is that there is some tension that is developing between Ellie and her dad, Sheriff Tucker, because Tucker is sort of slow playing the investigation, and Ellie feels like it seems like maybe she's starting to distrust him already at this point, and she feels like there's a reason why her father might be trying to not solve the crime right away. And
mm.
so she's decided that she's going to go out on her own and she's going to get the job done. So she takes Dennis and Jed with her, and they drive out to this motel that's on the edge of town where she believes that the killer is hiding out. And Ellie and Dennis are going to actually enter into the killer's room, and they find these files here with Dennis's photo in them. So we know Dennis is tied in somehow to the killer. And just as Ellie is starting to see these documents, boom, we have this giant explosion, and the whole motel goes up in a ball of fire. But the other thing that Ellie sees laying next to those files is a little piece of origami. And we had learned earlier in the book that origami is a hobby of her father's. Sheriff Tucker has these little origami frames all over his office, and he has commented on them before, and he's just making them every time you see him when he's not actively out running around. And so now Ellie is going to really suspect her father of having something to do with these killings.
I really enjoyed this investigative part of the story. This might be my favorite issue, as well, I don't know. I say that, but I really enjoy the investigative nature, and I also enjoy the little vignettes about just the life in nowhere, and brings some humanity to some very unhuman looking characters.
Sure.
We have a story of an anniversary meal, and a mother and father, or husband and wife, who are also a mother and father, worried about their son. And then we also get the story of the six-armed man taking care of his younger sister, who seems to be disabled in some way. And so you get some humanness in a story that so far is very unhuman in a lot of ways. So I really enjoyed those parts, and the investigative of a kind of rundown motel and then an explosion is right up my alley. So I really enjoyed that piece of it as well.
Yeah, this is sort of the law and order segment of
Mm.
this graphic novel. Well, Sheriff Tucker has a moment at home with his own wife, and they're having kind of this tender moment where Tucker is having some doubts about himself. And remember, he's the only regular human person that we've encountered so far other than Dennis. And it's clear that he has some kind of connection to the outside world that nobody else in Nowhere actually has. And so he's asking his wife without being very specific about how, do you think I'm a good man? And he's saying how sometimes I have to do things that don't sit right with me, but they're for the greater good of Nowhere. And while we're having this conversation, that narrator who's been tracking the events throughout this third issue that has still not been revealed to us is commenting on the character of Sheriff Tucker. He has this line where he says, "The zookeeper is revealed to be a prison warden." And we kind of start to get the sense for the first time that whatever Sheriff Tucker is doing, he is trying to cut the residents of Nowhere off from the rest of the world. We don't exactly know why. Well, while Sheriff Tucker and his wife are having this moment, that nail gun guy shows up again outside of Sheriff Tucker's house. And the sheriff sees him, looks out the window and sees him, and then actually leaves with him. And as these two men go together and get in a car, we see that Ellie is watching all of this unfold from her own parked car. So she's started surveillance at this point on her own dad.
I hadn't noticed that on either reading before. I got very distracted by the Scrabble board that's on the next page of the way the book falls. That is very interesting. I hadn't noticed that she was observing them before.
Carson, I love that. I love that. It's like, well, we got a Scrabble game now. And
Right.
hey, I'm a man who is drawn to a puzzle,
Uh huh.
which is why I like detective stories so well.
Right.
But yeah, you put a Scrabble board in front of me too. I think that could be distracting.
Yeah. I'm looking at it. I'm like, oh, okay, something's happening over here. Not a whole lot of words. Ooh, Scrabble. Let's look at this. But going into the Scrabble, we come back to one of the vignettes with the husband and wife who are celebrating their anniversary.
Right, that couple that we had observed from issue 2, and at the time we saw them in issue 2, these were just, a couple of sweet characters from nowhere. Now, in this couple, the husband is bird or has a bird head, and the wife has a fish head, so that does kind of remind us of Jed. And through some of their conversation where they are concerned about their son, I mean, Jed is the kind of son that set of parents like this would have some concern about. There's no doubt about it.
Mm,
And sure enough, it's revealed that these are Jed's parents. And Dennis and Jed show up there at their home because they need a place to hide out. So we've got this lovely couple. And I'll tell you, this for me was maybe the most touching part of the story, Carson,
mm,
was that the Birdman dad and the Fishman mom, don't say, "Yeah, you can hide out here. You don't have to ask permission to hide out here." They say,
mm,
"This is your home." They
mm-hmm.
welcome him back, even though it seems like he has been maybe not estranged, but gone, absent from their lives for some period of time where they've just been at home worrying about him.
It's a very sweet moment when they invite, or not invite him back in, but tell him that he's always able to come home. And I think it rings even more true because of his addiction and his struggles with alcoholism and really trying to be out on his own, that he lives a very reactionary and disruptive lifestyle, where this probably isn't the first time that he's interrupted them by coming home and needing a place to crash or needing something. You can feel the years in the relationship in just a few short images and words. You feel that time, which I think is a testament to the storytellers again, that they can make it feel that real, especially coming from that perspective of substance abuse, of living a very reactionary and, I'm just trying to like scrap together some dollars by chopping wood. That he seems to think that's a brilliant idea, even though as the reader we go like, that's not a good idea. Why would you even attempt to do that? But to him it seems real and something that he can use to get back on his feet and continue on his better life. And he still ends up crashing into his parents' home and saying, hey, I need a place to stay. So all of that kind of adds up to this moment here.
Carson, I wish I could pull from my memory right now what this is. It's a song that I've listened to very recently, and I
Hmm.
cannot put my finger on it. But this line stood out to me. The character in the song saying, "Don't ask me about tomorrow. I can barely think about today."
Mm,
And it's exactly that idea that you're describing, that the person can't make long-term plans because they are obsessed with the here and now.
mm. Yeah, no, that's really good. A much more concise way of saying all of that. And I'll look up that song, and I probably won't have heard the song. Just a tease for the Silver Silver episode. I've gotten a few texts that I didn't know. I think it was Dire Straits. I think that was the band that you
Yes,
mentioned.
yes, Dire
Uh,
Straits.
that I didn't know the song. Somebody's actually sent me the link to the song that you referenced in that episode, and I still had not. I actually had not heard the song.
No
So
kidding.
yeah,
Yeah,
whichever one you
in
said
that
they're most famous for, I can't remember what
yeah,
it is now.
it's their song "Money for Nothing."
Hmm.
And, as I said on that podcast, it's it's not that good of a song. The song that you need to listen to by Dire Straits is "Sultans of Swing." So check that one out.
Okay,
But I
I
guess I'm
will.
getting us away from our story a little bit
Yep.
here. So let's
Sorry.
let's turn back because I think of all the sort of twists and cliffhanger endings we've had through this story so far, the best one, the most exciting one anyway, is the reveal of the narrator right here at the end of chapter 3. And do you want to talk us through that, Carson?
Yeah, yeah. So we towards the end of chapter 3, we have the man who's in the hazmat suit and the gas mask. walking up, continuing to talk about how he's a voyeur, a peeping Tom, a surveyor of a controlled environment, but now he's here in the place that he's been watching. He knocks on the door of what we know is Jed's parents' house, and they answer the door, kind of annoyed that they're being interrupted yet again on their anniversary. And he reveals himself to be Galvin Chow, and he's the reason that they're in trouble. It's all his fault. So that is kind of how chapter 3 ends. And I said it at the beginning. I do think that chapter 3 is my favorite of the five issues in this story. I think it has the most to say and probably the clearest development of story.
The man in the hazmat suit being the narrator we've been listening to
Mm,
for this whole issue really shook me.
mm.
I was like, holy cow, okay, that's what this weird guy in the hazmat suit is doing in this town. And now he's going to enter and be a character in our story, not just the observer anymore.
Yeah, and I think I was excited on the upon second reading to have noticed those times that he pops up, because he pops up in times where if Dennis had paid attention more or taken the opportunity to engage this character that he is seeing in the hazmat suit, our story might have turned out very differently. When he drives by and the Galvin is just standing there waving, if he hadn't thought that he was still tripping or in a dream world in any sense, he may have questioned it more. Or when they're in the woods and they see him again, instead of engaging him, he's called back to react to the tree person picking up Jed. And so I just think the different parts of Dennis, he had opportunities to change the story and for it to turn out differently than it does, but we end up here with Galvin having to reveal himself at Jed's parents' home.
He sure does. And we go into chapter 4 by rewinding the clock a little bit to about 1 week before the events of the first 3 issues.
Hmm.
And Dennis and Galvin are sitting at a bar together, and Dennis is drunk. And I mean, drunk to the point that he can barely keep his eyes open. I mean, his engagement in this conversation is really just by reacting to something in the last few words that Galvin has said that might not have even conveyed the full idea of whatever Galvin was talking about. And we figure out from this conversation that these two men have just met, and Dennis is drinking himself into a stupor over having just walked out on his wife and his newborn. They're sort of having these like parallel conversations because Dennis is trying to unload his soul about what he's just done. And maybe this is why he's getting so drunk right now that he's just walked out on his wife and left a baby behind, which sort of takes us back a little bit to that dream sequence at the beginning of issue number 2. But meanwhile, Galvin is not trying to hear all that. He is trying to tell his own story and really like unburden his own soul. And he's telling Dennis some story that Dennis is not picking up about this secret nuclear explosion at North Warwick 64 years ago. And of course, North Warwick we know as nowhere. Well, coming back up to the present time, and Galvin is explaining this same backstory to Jed and Dennis and Jed's family at all at once. And he explains that nowhere is, quote, part of an off the book experiment testing short range effects of concentrated radiation on the human body. So, this was an intentional, yes, explosion that had taken place 64 years ago over nowhere. I guess we don't necessarily know that. I think we assume that the government caused the explosion, or
Mm.
maybe they just decided after this explosion happened in this little sleepy California town that they were going to take advantage of the situation and isolate the people there and sort of observe over time what effects the exposure to that radiation has on these folks.
Right. And they even took it a step further and intentionally poured in experimental medicine to their water system to see how that would also affect their mutations.
Yeah. And a lot of this fourth chapter is told in different time sequences. We do a lot of bouncing back and forth. And at one point, we bounce back to 63 years ago. So a year after that explosion had taken place. And we see that people's bodies are starting to deform. There's this grocer who's holding up a watermelon in one panel that we see, and his fingers are so long that he can basically grip the whole watermelon in his hand. And we see other people starting to take on bird-like features or fish-like features or Allen hooks on their hands. Well, we jump again to a scene from just 1 week ago in the timeline of our story. And now we're seeing Galvin and Dennis walking through this secret government facility where Galvin works. And we learn that Galvin's job, he's a young guy. He was not around 63 years ago. I mean, he's probably in his 20s. But this has been going on so long, you're going to have to replace your workforce at this secret facility. And Galvin's job is to sit in this room with just a giant wall full of monitors and observe the goings on in nowhere. Something else we learn about their relationship is that Galvin is Dennis's new sponsor in like an AA type program. Galvin is saying every time Dennis is like objecting, like, you're not supposed to take me in here, are you? What's going on? Galvin is saying, like, look, if I'm going to be your new mentor in this relationship, that I've got to start with my confession to you. And, this is his opportunity to sort of tell his story.
It's a very interesting reveal considering they started a bar with Dennis drinking and Galvin drinking as well. That he seems he's some sort of sponsor in some sort of Alcoholics Anonymous program. That this is where they end up. That's it's not very encouraging.
Right. Galvin is off the wagon at this point.
Mm.
And of course, he's been drinking and his judgment is certainly impaired. And he's giving away big time government secrets, the kind that they might have to send a guy into a place with a nail gun to sort
Mm.
out after they take place. At the very least, we know that there are going to be significant consequences for the people of Nowhere and also for Galvin and Dennis as a result of this. Well, we move back into our present in the timeline, and we've got that nail gun guy again. We've learned that his name is Bob, and we figure out that he is the government's fixer on the Nowhere Project. And so he is actually now right outside of Jed's family's house. And Jed's dad is looking out the window trying to figure out who is this guy with a nail gun. And now he's got not just a regular nail gun, but some like souped up version of the nail gun. It kind of reminded me of like a super soaker or something like that, except it's used for shooting nails. And as Jed's dad is looking out the window, boom, this nail comes flying in and just hits him right between the eyes. And of course, Jed's mom starts panicking. They're all jumping down to the floor, and it's like fast and furious. These nails are just flying in through the windows and through the walls, and everybody's, hiding out. It's kind of a classic shootout scene. And in the midst of all of this hairiness again, we go back in time to that 1 week ago. And we see that after they'd been to that government facility, Galvin actually got in a car and drove Dennis to the outskirts of nowhere so that they could get kind of a look. And we're going to realize what we are seeing right now are the events that lead us up to the beginning of issue 1.
Mm.
Because as they're driving toward town, Galvin sees that two-tailed dog out in the street, and he swerves to avoid the dog, and he crashes his car into the woods, runs off the highway, flips over upside down, and Galvin kind of panics. Sees that Dennis is unconscious there laying next to him, and Galvin just gets out of the car and runs off on foot, leaving the car there behind him. And so jumping now back into the present, Galvin, Jed, and Dennis flee from Jed's parents' house in this little rowboat that they've got. This town is on the coastline. And Jed's mom stays back behind, and she's going to die with her husband, holding on to her husband's body as he's lying there on the floor. And as Jed is making his way out of the house and going to that rowboat, and knowing that he, for certain, is leaving his mom behind to die right after his dad has, he makes the promise that he is going to stop his drinking, and there's not going to be any more of this. And as they rowed ashore elsewhere in town, Ellie meets up with them and says that they're all going to have to come with her, and they're going to have a face-off now with Sheriff Tucker.
And the scene of the house exploding behind them as they row away might be my favorite single panel out of the whole book. The way the watercolors and the artwork work together is haunting because it's an explosion and there's people dying, but also it is quite beautiful, the way the reds and the blues play off of each other on that panel, for sure.
So we'll move into chapter 5, and this is the last issue or the last chapter in this story. And it felt to me at the start of this issue like there's a whole lot of story to be wrapped up here in,
Yes.
20 something pages. And sure enough, this one is just off to the races. So we open up with Ellie facing off with her dad, and the entire town has learned the truth at this point about nowhere. And they have come out sort of like a scene out of Frankenstein. All these townspeople, some of them we recognized before, like Cullen, our six-armed man, they come out with pickaxes and chainsaws, and one guy actually has a pitchfork, like in Frankenstein. And the angry mob is going to have Ellie's back in this fight against Sheriff Tucker and a couple of the sheriff's deputies that are staying loyal to Tucker at this point. Well, as this fight is about to break out, Jed sort of breaks off from the main fight and he goes and tracks down Bob with the nail gun. And they start having this really well depicted knockdown drag out fight that's going back and forth between the two of them. There's a time where I think Jed looks like he's going to be strangled to death. And
Hmm.
I'd actually, in my notes, kind of written him off as a character, except we're going to see that the fight proceeds. But in different fights, as the action moves forward here, we've got Nailgun Bob is going to shoot off the smaller head of the owner of the hardware store. And as he does, this is kind of gruesome. Jed is standing behind Bob and he's got an axe and he splits Bob's head right down the middle. I mean, just splits it like a watermelon. And the two sides, are going to fall in half. This is going to be the end of Bob. I think there's no question about it.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, we look over to Dennis and where he is in this fight with all the villagers and everything kind of in that main area of town. And Dennis pushes a button that he had gotten from Galvin. And what we learn this button does is it blows up all of the monitors back at that government facility. So there's going to be a blackout period where maybe all the villagers, if they can get past Sheriff Tucker, they can escape nowhere and try and roll the dice with new lives somewhere else in the world. And then Dennis also has another trick up his sleeve. He unleashes that giant iguana that we saw back in chapter 1 on Sheriff Tucker. And I mean, this is wild. That lizard sticks his tongue out, grabs up the sheriff, bites his head off, and spits it back out. And, Sheriff Tucker's poor decapitated head is just sort of, bouncing along the roadside here. I think it's fair to say that that's going to be the end of this character as well.
Yeah, I think so. This is where the end of issue 4 and most of issue 5 is where it starts to lose me a little bit. And this may be where we differ a little bit, is the action sequences. Bob with the nail gun comes to attack Jed's parents' house, and we switch back and forth between three different fights that are going on in chapter 5. Those type of scenes where the abstractness seems to take over a little bit in the artwork. It becomes less definitive what is happening because of just the stylized artwork that is happening. That, and this is a consistent theme with me outside of this novel as well, is that when animated movies or TV shows get to a hyper stylized violent fight sequence, I tend to lose interest and tend to just not be able to track what's going on as much. And so that's my one big complaint, is that even upon second reading, there's some of the fights that are happening, and I'm not really sure. Jed's fight is the clearest against Bob. The other one's against Sheriff Tucker and with Ellie, his daughter. They don't seem as clear to me, and I find myself losing interest in the story at those points.
I do wonder, Carson, this is a thing that happens sometimes because this was originally published in single issue format.
Mm-hmm.
The ability of the story to proceed is dependent entirely on issue sales.
Mm,
And so it might be that this was planned for 6 issues.
mm,
And then, maybe, and look, I am just speculating here. This just happens sometimes
yeah.
where a writer and artist are told, like, look, here's where the sales are on this book. You might need to wrap this up a little quicker than you had it planned.
Mm.
Know whether that happened here or not, because you're right. There is a lot of chaos in this issue, and it's kind of hard to keep up with. But in the end, I think we can resolve ourselves here that Bob with the nail gun is dead,
Yep.
Sheriff Tucker is dead,
Yep.
and there's this blackout period
Mm,
where the government folks are not going to be able to observe what happens in nowhere. And so in this aftermath, all these characters have to make decisions about what they're going to do next. Dennis decides that he is going to go home to his wife and baby, which is really kind of awesome. I have to assume that this is not the first time that Dennis has disappeared for a week
mm-mm.
because of the nature of his addiction. And so it might not even be apparent when he gets home to Dennis's wife that he actually intended to walk out on the family and never come back. Well, Jed and the people of Nowhere decide that they're going to stay in their home and that even though they know they could leave without government interference, at least during this small window, that, you know what, this is their home. And maybe it's not going to be such a hospitable world out there for a guy with a fish head or person with blue skin or this other character we haven't mentioned before who doesn't have any skin at all. We see his the viscera, we see his muscles and his bones. And Galvin decides that he's going to stay in Nowhere as well. He says, "Hey, look, I know that you guys need a bartender because Bob killed your last one. And so maybe this will be my new home." I mean, certainly there's not much for him outside of Nowhere at this point. Well, we have this kind of touching scene where, and I really, Carson, want to hear what you think about this.
Yeah.
Dennis, Jed, and Galvin all sort of agree that they are going to swear off drinking and other substances for good.
Right.
But they kind of make a joke about knowing that it's a promise they can't keep.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is sort of this tacit acknowledgement that, okay, we feel very resolved right now, but we also know the nature of our addictions.
Yeah, it's a very interesting end to the story. I'm left conflicted, and this may be where I want one more issue, to maybe, I don't know. I like happy endings,
Sure.
and I'm not sure that we get that fully here. And maybe and I'm sure that's the point. Just as a reader, sometimes I want it a little bit more wrapped up than it is because they do make the joke about sobriety being a cinch and that they're making promises they probably can't keep. And then we have this scene of Dennis picking up a payphone and making a call to his wife, talking about his internal monologue, talking about you're an addict, you've always been an addict, relapse, rehab, halfway house, relapse. That cycle that he's constantly in. And then all of a sudden, we get this big image of him, and he has a third eye on his forehead, and so it seems to be that the radiation from the nuclear blast that has occurred 64 years ago has taken its toll on him in just a week and being in Nowhere. And then we see him walking away from the payphone. From the phone, we hear, "Dennis, where are you?" And to me, I'm like, okay, I want to know what comes next in Dennis's story. I want to know, does he go back home? Does he completely walk away? What's the end of his story? And I'm interested to hear your interpretation of that.
I had just assumed until we have this scene at the payphone that Dennis was going to be good on his word and turn
Mm,
around and go back to his family. It seems like he has the motivation in this moment to pursue sobriety
right.
and to reunite with his family. But when we see that he drops the payphone and just sort of walks away without ending the call,
Mm,
and the way the page is drawn, it certainly looks like he's just walking off into the sunset.
right.
It makes me think that maybe he's just decided to go his own way completely.
Right.
And with that eye that has grown on his forehead, it also leaves an opening if these creators ever wanted to come back to this story, that they could tell about Dennis's adventures, you know, beyond this.
And I think it harks back to another character that we're introduced that we haven't talked about yet, which is the sheriff's father. 64 years ago, also grew a third eye. Was his defect that came along with the radiation experiments in Nowhere, and he developed this third eye that could see splashes of color, and that it changed the way he saw his home and his wife and his son. It changed his entire perspective. And I think that's what the author or the storytellers are getting at here, is that because we also, on this last page, that's full panel, that splashes of color that we are assuming come from Dennis's third eye and having this new perspective on life. So it may be hopeful in the end as well, that even though he may or may not go home to his wife and son, he does have this new perspective on life and a way to see things differently than he has before, even though he has this past and maybe future as an addict.
Carson, I really like that analysis of the end of the story. And sometimes I like a story that ends with a character walking off, and we, as the reader of the book or the audience watching the movie, don't know and are left to wonder
Mhm.
what is next for this character. Because there
Right.
are two very different roads he could turn down.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Jed and Galvin, to go back to maybe your initial question, their choices to try to talk about sobriety being essential is really funny that Galvin is also choosing to be a bartender in this moment. Said, I think I'll be the new bartender, but I'm also going to stay sober. And there's just like a part of you that goes, we know that's not going to go well. And, but
Right.
again, it's that same thing that Jed had earlier where we're going to chop wood and get money and it's going to be, this is a great plan. And you're sitting there thinking, this is not a great plan at all. And it really does bring me back to kind of my real world every day at my job, that I have an opportunity to interact with people who are going through some recovery, that every once in a while they'll come to me with an idea and I'm like, I just have to tell them, like, dude, that's terrible. Like, you can't go do that. It's not to, put them down in any way, but we all have ideas that aren't bad. There just seems to be that sometimes there's a lack of discernment with somebody who's struggling with an addiction, that, and that's very apparent here in this story that's being told, that sometimes the ideas that come to their head are just the first ones that come and they just act on them. And I think we see that a lot throughout the story, which is another one of the things that just rang very true to me, possibly more than anything else in the story.
Any idea for a plan that gives you hope
Mm.
would be something you're going to grasp for right away.
Right. Right, exactly. How can I get to the point that people trust me again? How can I reach the point of having stability? And whatever the fastest and quickest way to get there is, I'm going to take that. But then we also see that little, I guess, flashback to Dennis coming downstairs saying he had a rough night, and his wife saying, "You always have had a rough night." And then we are led to believe that he then ends up in the bar with Galvin drinking again. And it's a cyclical thing of, okay, I'm going to try again today and then fail again and try again and then fail again. And seeing that, the Maxwell Prince who is writing this, I have to believe has some experience in his own life or in somebody else's, somebody that he's close to in their life, struggling with addiction of some sort, because there's ways that he's just presenting these things that ring so true.
Tell me about that little joke that they make about promises that they can't keep.
Mm,
When you are in conversation with somebody who is in a place where they are actively working on overcoming addiction
hmm
or finding their way out of addiction, does that sort of gallows type humor come through sometimes? Like maybe there's a recognition that they know the statistics, they understand the percentages of, some people have to relapse two
mm.
dozen times before they've reached their bottom and are really ready to make change in their life.
Yeah, there's a certain point in one's journey that there does tend to come in that dark sense of humor, and you're able to make some jokes, and I think that does bring some light and levity to what can be a very dark and heavy situation, where there are guys and women that are going through this and leaving behind well-paying jobs and family, kids, husbands, wives, to come work on themselves, to try to reach that point of stability and sobriety. And that at some point there does, when you get far enough away and you have 2 3 weeks sober, and even a couple months maybe, sometimes depending on the relationship that you have, you do get that darker sense of humor about it. And the guys that I know that have been sober for years will even make jokes as far as, "Yeah, I've never had a better time than when I was on meth." And you're like, "How can you say that?"
Mhm.
But they do, because you have to accept that it is a part of your past, and it's a part of where you are today. It's a part of who you are today, is that you went through those things, and recognizing that, yeah, I may never feel those feelings, those highs again that are unnatural due to the substances that I was intaking. But there does become that dark sense of humor, for sure.
Well, as we wrap up here, you have any sort of overall thoughts on this book? I'll tell you, I never know where these conversations are going to go. And I think the addiction aspects of this story didn't stand out as much to me,
Mm.
and they are certainly heavily there. And so our conversation really brought those out a lot to me. And frankly, that allows me to appreciate this story and think about these characters in a way that I had not grabbed onto fully before. And so I love that.
I love that we got to talk about it, and there is kind of this, the connection between the addiction part of the story and the nuclear blast part of the story. I haven't quite been able to pinpoint what that is. Even having now, kind of as we've talked about it, read it almost 3 times, there seems to be some sort of connection there, but I can't exactly pinpoint what it is. There's part of me, the conspiracy theory part of me, and this is, I don't know if this is going to come to a surprise to you or not, but there's a lot of guys that have come through the recovery program that I'm connected to who love conspiracy theories, like love them. And I'm not a big conspiracy theory guy at all. But if you give them a little bit of room to talk about a conspiracy theory, a few of them will just jump on it. But the conspiracy theory part of me is thinks about that line from Galvin where he says they also intentionally introduced medicine into the water supply. So there's something that makes me think that that part of the story is saying something about the opioid crisis going on in our world today, where a drug was introduced almost with full knowledge about how addictive it was, and there's some level of hands off, we're going to see how it plays out, intentionally or unintentionally. And I'm trying not to become a conspiracy theorist myself here, but there's part of me that thinks that there is something in the story that connects the government nuclear blast to the addiction part. And I haven't been able to pinpoint exactly what it is, but it has stuck with me after reading it the first time, and then since reading it again in preparation for this. So I don't know. Did you have any thoughts kind of related to the nuclear blast and drug or addiction part of the story?
No, no, I didn't really pick up on any of that
Mm.
or see a connection there. And that's not to say there isn't one or there wasn't one in the mind of the creators as they were putting this story together. But it's something I didn't take away from this
Mm.
book. And so I'm very interested to hear you talk about it.
Yeah. And I think that even you could look at the deformities of most of our characters in the story. And then we get to the end of Dennis's story, and he develops that third eye that allows him to see the world differently. And there may be a level of acceptance that comes along with that, where he develops this thing after spending time a week in nowhere, and develops a new part of him that he then can take with him and allows him a new perspective on life, and kind of that hopeful take at the end of the story, if you choose to go that route. Maybe that he has accepted that part that then allows him the jokes that have a little bit of darkness to them, or to be able to move on and accept that that was a part of his life, but it may not be moving forward. I think you could also see the deformities in that way as well as a part of the story.
I love it. Carson, thank you so much for coming on and talking with me about this book.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing those ideas and really highlighting for me stuff that went right past me. I have enjoyed this tremendously. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, for all of our listeners, I hope that you enjoyed this as well. If you're still with us, come and check back in with us again next week. Thank you so much for being here. And until then, keep reading those comics.